Hey, so this is Otto or In Touch from LB Biology, and today I'm going to be giving you the solution to this custom-made problem about cell biology. And you can see from the title, it says size really matters. So size in this case is size of the cell. So this topic is mentioned, not isn't really mentioned much in camps. I'm talking about Olympiad camps, but it is heavily mentioned in uh, my National Olympiad and also the International Biology Olympiad from the past papers. So, okay, let's get to the point. So, okay, before I start, giving you the solutions and stuff, uh, you, the viewer, you should try and do this, on your own. And okay, so maybe you've already done it, or maybe you just want to skip to the lesson. We're just gonna jump straight to it. So, okay, so in this question right here, in this problem right here, I've given you two types of cells. So we have mycoplasma on the left, and we have Valonia, the algae, the big unicellular cell on the right here. And these two cells, they differ in size, of course. And us, the student, just the student, wants us to, I guess, compare the surface area and the volume. But to do that, we must assume that both cells are spheres. Okay. So yeah, since they're spherical, we can use these equations to find the volume and the surface area. Now, the question also, uh, it is given that, okay, the diameter of mycoplasma and Valonia is 1 micron and 1 centimeter respectively. Okay, that's is important to note. Okay, now let's get straight to the problems, the actual problem. So we can see that this is actually a multiple true false problem, which means that okay, in this case, it is given four statements, and we must indicate if each of these statements are true or false. No, from from our, I guess, knowledge on biology and plus the information is given in the problem. So, okay, let's just, start with the first statement. So it says here that based on the information, the volume of Lonia is 1 trillion times greater than mycoplasma. So how could we do that? So we can start calculating right away. So if we want to compare Valonia's volume to mycoplasma's volume, we must put Valonia like this, the volume Valonia over the volume of mycoplasma. Okay, and we can just plug in the formula. So that would be 4 over 3 pi r cubed Valonia, and in the denominator it would be mycoplasmas. So you can see that these constants over here, they can be canceled out. Now, we would yield something like this, okay? But remember, this R right here, that's the radius. But the the problem in itself, it is giving us the diameter. But if we're very familiar with, mathematical relations, basically diameter and radius are, I guess, they're proportional to each other. So, okay, but if we want to be rigorous here, we can write down that D is exactly equal to 2 times R. Okay. 2 times the radius. We can write that the radius is equal to 2 over a d over 2. So with that knowledge, we can plug in d over 2 for each radius in this case. And basically the twos cut out, they cancel out, and now we have the diameter of Valonia over diameter of mycoplasma, every, everything to the cubed, I guess, to the power of 3. So if we plug in the values we've gotten, so for Valonia, it's 1 centimeter, right? That's 1 times 10 to the power of -2 meters. And for mycoplasma, 1 micron is 10 to the power of -6. Now, if we do a bit of calculation here, we would get something like this. So 10 to the power 4 to the power 3, that would be 10 to the power 12, which is 1 trillion. So we can see that compare Valonia to Mycoplasma, we get 10 to the power of 12, which is exactly what statement 1 states. So for statement 1, it would be true. Now let's move on to statement 2. It says that based on the information, Valonia has a surface area to value ratio. Now, what is that? And it says right here that it has this ratio, I mean the Valonia has the ratio that is 10,000 times greater than Mycoplasma's. Okay. Now, first of all, surface area to value ratio. Now, okay. So let's put this simply. So this is just surface area over volume. Now remember that we're comparing this ratio of Valonia to Mycoplasma. Now we're gonna do pretty much the same thing, but instead of volume, we're gonna use the ratio. So it's basically fractions over fractions. Now it's gonna be a little bit, overwhelming, but in actuality, it's not really. So now we're just gonna just plug in the equations for surface area. That's 4 pi r squared. So for the top, it's Valonia. Wait. And we're also gonna use the same equation from 4. So for the volume. Now we're just gonna copy this. It's basically the same for the top and bottom. Now we're doing pretty much the same thing here. We cancel out the constants. You can see that on top for Valonia here, we see that this is to the power of 2. This is to the power of 2, and this is to the power of 3. What we get from this is that we're gonna get something like this. So 1 over r of Valonia, and for this it's 1 over r of Mycoplasma. Now, since basically we're doing a switcheroo here, okay, most of you probably get what I'm doing. This is more of a math thing. Okay, now we get something like this, Rm over R. Now we remember from before that basically R and D have like direct proportion. They have I guess direct correlation. So we're just gonna get, so this is basically equivalent to dm over dv. Now, if we want to find the answer, we just basically we just plug in the values. For Mycoplasma, it's 1 micron, right? So this meters, Valonia is 1 centimeter, it's this. Now we would get 10 to the power of -4, which is exactly 1 over 10,000. Now, you see that we're comparing Valonia to Mycoplasma, and our answer is saying that Valonia here has 1 over 10,000 times this value compared to Mycoplasma, which means that Valonia is 10,000 times less than Mycoplasma in terms of this ratio. So basically, what this statement is getting wrong here is that it should be less. Okay, so that means number 2 is false. Now you see here, this took us a lot of time, right, to calculate all of this out. Now there's actually a trick here. Remember that our ratio here, the surface area over volume ratio here, is basically we can reduce it to this, right? So what that means is that our ratio, surface area to volume ratio, is proportional to 1 over r being the radius, right? Now, what r means is basically the size of the cell, right? If r is big, the cell is big. Now, if R is big, in this case, it's Valonia, right? Compared to Mycoplasma, Valonia is huge. And if R is huge, R is big, that means that this fraction is basically getting lower, right? And that means that this ratio is lower because this is like the inverse, relation. R is inversely related to the ratio. Now, okay. So with that in mind, we can just, I guess, observe that, okay, since Valonia is bigger, even though we don't know how much, I guess, the difference in magnitude, right? The size of the difference. But we can see straight away that since Valonia has a greater radius, that means that it must have a lower ratio, the surface area to volume ratio. So that's basically the trick. You don't have to calculate all of this. We can just observe, right? Okay, now end of number two. Let's go to number three. Now, number three is a bit trickier to explain too. Now, you see, for number three, all right, for number three, it says here that if we increase the mass of the cell by 8 times, it will approximately halve its surface area to volume ratio. It basically meaning that it's gonna, I guess, lower the surface area to volume ratio by a half. Now, how do we start? How do we even start? So you can see that we added something here to our situation here. It's mass. We don't really talk about mass, right? So if you remember from physics class, there's actually some very there's an important, I guess you could say, formula. It's density, which is D in this case, equals mass, so M, divided by volume. So okay, now I guess we can assume that since cells, most of the time cells are homogeneous, even though they have like a mixture of, I guess, organelles in the cytosol. And okay, but we're just gonna assume that most of the time D is gonna be constant. Okay. Now, if D is constant, we can rearrange this and we would get something like mass equals D times V. And since D is basically constant, right? That means that M, the mass, is directly proportional to the volume. Now, what does that mean? Since the volume is directly proportional to R cubed, we're gonna get that M is directly proportional to R cubed. Okay. Now this is a bit of a math thing, but you math whiz probably would get it. So okay. Now just bear with me. Okay. So since we know that we can basically say that okay, R cube is proportional to M mass. If we take the third root, okay, if we take the third root of this, of both sides, we're going to get that R is proportional to the third root of M, or M to the power of 1 over 3, if you're being technical. Okay, now, this is some crucial information right here, because we're going to use this to find our answer. So, okay, let's backtrack a little, and we can see that the problem in itself is asking for the relationship of the ratio, the surface area to volume ratio to mass. So let's just start with the surface area to volume ratio. Now, okay, we know from before, we know from this right here, right? Okay, that this ratio right here is inversely proportional to R, right? So we write it like this. Now, what we're gonna do is that we're gonna continue this, chain. So we know from this that R is this blah blah blah, and we're just gonna plug this in basically, and we're gonna get something like this. Now, what we're gonna do next is just gonna plug in our number because okay, if the mass is gonna increase by 8 times, we're just gonna plug in 8, right? Okay, so we're gonna yield 1 over 2. What does that mean? You see that basically what this is saying is that if we increase the mass by 8 times, right, our surface area to volume ratio is gonna be 1 over 2. So this is basically, it means it lowers to it decreases by half. Now, this is exactly what statement 3 is saying. So that means statement 3 is true. Now you see this is quite a lot to grasp in, but just let it digest for a while. So, okay. Now let's move on to our last statement. Number four, it says in general, larger animals consist of larger cells, compared to smaller animals. So, okay, before we go, straight to the answering, let's talk a bit more about this concept about surface area to volume ratio. Now, this is very, very important. So, okay, let's assume something first. So let's say we have a cell, and this is a pretty small cell, let's say. And this cell right here is a cube, actually. Okay. Now this cube, okay, so this cube right here is gonna have a side length. I mean, it's not really a side, it's edge. So the length of the edge would be 1 unit for this cell. Now, let's say we have another cell, which is 2 times larger. So that means each side, or more technically edge, would be 2 units in length, right? Okay, now we have our two cells. We want to compare the surface area and volume, right? Let's say we have surface area and volume. Okay, and okay, so let's find the surface area of each cell in this case. So, okay, so we know that each side for, this smaller cell is gonna be 1 unit, right? Because each side is 1 times 1. So each side is gonna be 1 unit squared. Now we know that a cube has six sides, right? So we just do 1 multiplied by 6, and we're gonna get 6. In this case, it's unit squared, right? You don't have to be exact or technical with that, but just put it right there. And for this bigger cell, it's gonna be what? So it's 2 times 2, right? For each side. And there's 6 sides, so basically 2 times 2 times 6, that is 24. Now, what about the volume? The volume, I would say it's pretty simple. So for the smaller one, we just do 1 times 1 times 1. So that would yield us 1. And for the bigger cell, it's basically 2 times 2 times 2, since both of these are cubes, right? And 2 times 2 times 2 is 8, right? Okay. Now, what about the surface area to volume ratio? Basically, we just do this, right? It's a 6 to 1. So for the bigger cell, it will be 24 to 8, so which is basically 3 to 1. And we can see that for the smaller cell, this ratio is bigger. But we already know that, right? Okay. Now, uh, let's assume a scenario here. So this is gonna be a bit, it's gonna be quite hypothetical here, but just bear with me. So imagine we have this same exact cell, the smaller one here. I'm gonna write it in 2D, but it's still 3D though. But basically, I'm getting this cell to see right here in 2D. I'm gonna put a nucleus here, just for aesthetic purposes. So okay, now let's say that this cell right here, not just this though, but also the bigger cell, the one that's 2 times larger, requires oxygen. Okay, let's assume that, okay, because most organisms that are aerobic, right, require oxygen. And let's say that each unit of value, okay, so 1 unit cube, because it's a cube, right, of volume, okay, let's assume, it's right here, assume requires, I'm just gonna write this arrow, right, requires 1 chunk of oxygen. Now this is pretty arbitrary, but let's just assume that, okay. I would say it's easier to look at this way. Now, 1 chunk of oxygen. Okay, cool. What's the other condition here? Because the first things first, oxygen is I guess oxygen gas exchange or whatever happens in the cell membrane, right? Oxygen is diffused. It goes through the process called diffusion into the cell. Okay. What does that mean? That means that the rate of diffusion, or the ability of oxygen to diffuse inside the cell, is correlated to the amount of cell membrane or the amount of whatever is, I guess, surrounding the cell. So that basically means the surface area, right? So the other thing we're going to assume here is that we're going to assume that one oxygen chunk is going to require 6 unit cubes of surface area. Now, this is this is where it gets spicy. So, okay, our little cell here, from this table right here, requires one oxygen chunk. Okay? Since it has 1 unit cubed of value, so it's going to require one oxygen chunk. And we know that our little cell here has a surface area of 6. And we know that 6 units of surface area will give us one chunk of oxygen. So one chunk of oxygen will be able to come inside the cell. If we do a bit of calculation here, yep, here we go. Now, what happens to this cell? So, I mean, the only one chunk of oxygen is available for this cell, right? But this cell requires only one chunk of oxygen. So this cell, do some net, I guess, uh, we do some calculations here. 1 minus 1 equals 0. So basically this cell is okay. And this cell is pretty much happy, right? It survives. But what about this other cell here, the larger one here? Now there's going to be some problems for this big guy. Because what's happening here is that, okay, from our table here, you see that this cell, okay, it has a value of 8. That means it requires 8 oxygen chunks, 8 oxygen, whatever. But you see, the surface area here is 24. And what that means is that we know that six units of surface area give us 1 oxygen chunk. But 24 units of surface area would give us what? 24 over 6, that's 4 oxygen chunks. So that means that only 4 oxygen chunks will come in, right? For its, I guess, the limitations of its amount of surface area. So you see, 4 is not enough to feed this cell because this cell requires 8. And this requirement comes from I guess, the overwhelming amount of value, that cells have. And that is basically the concept I'm trying to say. Okay, so this cell won't survive, right? So we wouldn't really be happy for him. All right, so enough with the jokes. So what I'm trying to convey to you guys here, what I'm trying to say is, when the cell is too big, the amount of value inside the cell is gonna be too overwhelming. There's gonna be too much. The reason for that is because remember our surface area to value ratio here? We know that this is it's inversely proportional to radius, right? This is because when the volume is in the denominator here, we know that for volume it's r cubed, but for the surface area that's on top is r squared, and we know that when it's r cubed has a bigger magnitude since it's to the power of 3, while the surface area is to the power of 2. That means the volume is going to grow faster than the surface area in terms of in terms of the value in mathematics. Okay, so yeah, it's when cells are too big, the volumes gets too big, and basically the surface area won't be capable enough to feed the amount of value because the surface area, or basically the surface, basically the area of the cell membrane, is responsible for intaking and also exporting waste out. So it's not just oxygen; it's loads of things. But basically, uh, when big cells won't have that ability to, I guess, maintain its entire value. Okay. But this is, I guess, the most I guess for common means, because sometimes when you have a cell like this, right, this is an exception. There's, I guess, its own set of adaptations and other stuff. And but for animals, for most living things, most multicellular living things, will obey to this rule. And this is why most cells stay small. Okay. That means for our statement in number 4 here, larger animals don't consist of larger cells. They consist of the same, their cells have the same size as smaller animals. But what's their what the difference is that larger animals consist of a higher number of cells. So higher number of cells, which is basically common sense. Okay. All right. So for number 4, it is false. All right. Now that is basically it uh for today. Thank you very much for listening.